Today, we are surrounded by many fragments of historical fact. We get the feeling that these pieces should be able to tell us something about the whole, but we also wonder if it is even possible for us to put this whole together in its entirety. In the last video, I spoke of the atmospheric conditions governing the creation of an imaginary picture of the past. This analogy can be extended. The primordial atmosphere which fostered the earliest forms of life on this planet can no longer be directly observed, but we can build a small-scale model which mimics the conditions of that early period in order to draw inferences about how life developed into what we see today and what was necessary for it to flourish. Likewise, an artificial reproduction of the past, like a kind of terrarium, may provide a climate for certain facts to emerge which we could only dream of hitherto. Of course, it must be admitted from the outset that there are limitations to this analogy. Unlike a physical model of a primitive atmosphere, which does not solely depend upon a subject's ability to remain conscious of certain facts, our imaginary historical model must be accessed through the further analogy of human sensibility and intuition, which are necessarily limited. As the astute scholar James I. Porter notes, the sensation of the whole is not something we can even directly experience. It comes mediated by an illusion that somebody else has already had, or rather seems to have had. It should be remembered that to even speak of the atmospheric conditions of the past is to presuppose a limit to the horizon of that specific time, which can only have been sustained by a specifically human perspective. Through the medium of another person's perspective, we can begin to piece together a more convincing picture of the world which came before ours. But whose perspective exactly should we trust to give us this impression of a unified picture of the past? If we refer to various written traditions, teachers were commonly thought of as a model for younger students to imitate and eventually join in sharing the memory of older forms of knowledge, as well as the events of the distant past. But this student-teacher relationship, called a succession by the Greeks, needed a model in turn. And for a long time at least, this model was always found especially in the succession of kings. It has been said that Alexander the Great owed much of his success in creating one of the largest empires to date to his teacher, the philosopher Aristotle. After the death of Alexander in the 3rd century BC, when power shifted rapidly across the new Greek world, the Ptolemaic rulers in Egypt sought to solidify and increase their power by closely associating themselves with the young conqueror. In addition to bringing his body to the Egyptian city named after Alexander, the Ptolemies used their great wealth to found the Museum, or Home of the Muses, modeled on Aristotle's Lyceum, which provided facilities and patronage to a community of intellectuals and scholars. Emulating the same type of instruction which was given to Alexander, the institution eventually included a vast library reported to contain over 500,000 scrolls, and it attracted kings and noblemen from all across the Greek world and beyond. As one scholar has pointed out, by adopting the practices of Aristotle's school and studying the texts of Homer, the foundation of this community helped to fill a cultural vacuum that had existed in the conquered Egyptian city, and provided a place for foreign Greeks to access their history and develop a feeling of continuity with it. But this feeling was a product of an intentional transformation and reorganization of knowledge, which could have only been accomplished with the reigning sovereign's desire to maintain power and create the appearance of a strong cultural identity within a fractured world. The medium through which people obtained their knowledge about history, culture, and the natural world started to function much differently than it had before. we can say that knowledge became institutionalized in the modern sense for the first time in Alexandria. It is no accident that of all places, Egypt served as the stage for the creation of a new centralized institution of learning. Egypt had a reputation in the ancient world for its long tradition of preserving valuable historical records. There had been an established class of royal priests and scribes for millennia, but it was always at risk of falling into disrepair due to the difficulty of maintaining a boundary between the specially trained scribes and the increasingly literate population, which consisted of many foreigners looking to uncover the long-protected secrets of Egyptian wisdom. For those living in the later classical period, it was widely thought that the most sophisticated forms of science, like astronomy, mathematics, theology, and medicine, were only to be found in Egypt. Many of the early Greek philosophers and sages are said to have traveled to Egypt for this very purpose, such as Thales, Pythagoras, Solon, and Democritus. And they supposedly borrowed many of their concepts and practices from the Egyptians. By the time of the Ptolemaic dynasty, however, much of Egyptian education had succumbed to distortion and decay, and Athens had become more famous for its intellectual activity. The arrival of Alexander marks the point when Egyptian knowledge had been pillaged beyond recovery. Although there had been many collections of writings in the past, the Alexandrian Museum was unique for its stated aim to collect every book ever written and to translate them all into the familiar Greek language. This was no doubt an attempt to reclaim but also reappropriate the intellectual status that Egypt once had. It's widely known that Ptolemy II, who had inherited the title of pharaoh from his father, even ordered his men to take any book that came into the city's port, immediately transcribe copies, store the originals, and give the copies back to the owners. This attempt to obtain all of the written knowledge in the world naturally caused a huge influx of books and a sudden awareness of just how many subjects there were to read about, including countless forgeries and imitations of original works. It's not hard to imagine that many of the titles held in the library were quickly tucked away, and never even bothered with due to their redundant and apparently uninformative nature. Living during this rising tide of books and their readers was a man called Timon from the Peloponnesian city of Phlius. Born roughly during the campaigns of Alexander, Timon began life as a stage dancer, and by an early age he had developed a strong relationship to the arts. Eventually he traveled all across Greece, never settling in one place for too long, and met with many famous people of the time, including King Ptolemy II. In order to make a living, he learned rhetoric and began to write poetry in many styles and genres. Being associated with the theater and religious festivals, Timon actively contributed to many public spectacles and performances. Timon became famous for his ironic style, in which he ridiculed popular philosophers and so-called wise men, always keen to point out their conceits and hidden dogmas. Despite his wide travels and ever-shifting profession, he preferred to keep to himself, away from the crowd. He differed from other writers at the time due to his deeper appreciation of music and rhythm, which had become less popular with the rise of private education and the newly emerging Alexandrian scholarship. Music had lost much of its vital importance in tragedy and comedy, and only a few writers, such as Aristophanes, had continued to employ complex meter in their plays. This lack of musical sense, in Timon's view, only contributed to miscommunication and confusion. For instance, nearly quoting Homer, he says, "Strife, the ruin of men, goes about shouting in vain. Unseen she rolls around everything, but then she fixes onto the head of a mortal, and casts him into hope." Whereas in the Iliad, this was the strife that accompanied men in bloody combat, the hope of glory and fame spurring them on to fight honorably. The strife Timon speaks of was of a much more literary nature. The classical writers and sophists engaged in never-ending battle with one another would have looked quite out of place compared to the noble warriors of the past. To Timon, none of them were as threatening or as persuasive as they thought, besides maybe Plato, who was a wrestler, and, according to Timon, a big fish, with the sweet voice of a cicada who sits on the trees of the academy, pouring forth a strain as delicate as a lily. As a poet and artist, Timon was quick to perceive a strong contrast between the preceding culture and his own. Using the complex form of parody, which functions much like a mirror, he sought to expose the contradictions and discontinuities within Greek education, and show the absurdities which drove educated men to plunge headlong into a battle of words and sophisticated disputation. A lot of commentary has been devoted to explaining the relationship between Timon and his supposed teacher, Pyrrho of Elis. Almost all modern literature on Timon seems to be more concerned with discerning the ideas of Pyrrho through the medium of Timon's mock poetry than with acknowledging the problems that this medium betrays. Although he certainly praised aspects of Pyrrho's uncertain attitude, it isn't clear that Timon simply adopts or agrees with his mysterious views. It should be noted that Pyrrho himself, like other popular philosophers, wrote nothing, and what little we have of what Timon writes about him is quite clearly just as much in the tone of parody as when he mimes and exaggerates the dispositions of all the other philosophers and pretenders of wisdom. What is clear is that even though he was missing an eye, Timon was able to see how irony works, and he would make use of it as often as he could. As far as we can tell, Timon actually took issue with the traditional idea of the student-teacher succession, and constantly drew attention to its inherently problematic nature within his writings. In fact, he himself had no students, although many philosophers later claimed him as their forerunner. As many Greeks were well aware, the student-teacher relationship was a nearly perfect reflection of the ideal relationship between a kingly father and his princely son, going all the way back to pre-Greek times. In Homer's much older picture of early Greek society, a king's legitimacy was tied strongly to his ancestry and the chain of rulership which was indistinguishable from divine right. But inevitably, this claim to direct legitimacy would soon appear false, if it was indeed ever valid in the first place. The godlike status that Alexander the Great was given by the cult started by Ptolemy II must be seen in the context of a failing distinction between legitimate ruler and power-hungry tyrant. This distinction could only be maintained as long as the king humbly gave honor to his ancestors and the gods who granted him power, thereby serving an essential role in establishing and respecting a conventional chain of authority. But of course, neither the young Alexander nor either of the Ptolemies had a conventional relationship with their forebears. Alexander's father Philip did not personally hand down his kingly title or traditional wisdom to his son. It was instead Aristotle, a rogue student of Plato, who taught Alexander with his hundreds of books at the Lyceum. And when, after radically changing the shape of the known world, Alexander died before the right to his throne could be firmly established, his general Ptolemy decided to foster the same half-royal relationship with his Greek subjects that led to the desperate invention of the entire Hellenistic world. Speaking of the museum in Alexandria, Timon remarked, "Many are feeding in populous Egypt, scribblers on papyrus, ceaselessly wrangling in the birdcage of the Muses." This might make one think of the exotic birds that were kept as pets and shown off during the massive circus-like processions that Ptolemy II organized in order to gain favor with the citizens. It seems that Timon's description of the museum came from direct experience. There is a strange irony in the fact that Timon was a prolific writer himself, and was said to be constantly disorganized, with his papers and books lying about in a chaotic mess. It seems he even lived in Alexandria for a time, and possibly worked under Ptolemy II, although he was always more of a wandering performer at heart. Standing at an ambiguous point, simultaneously outside and within the circle of contemporary scholarship and literature, Timon saw that the educated men of his day were enchanted by a competitive sophistry, and that they lacked the freedom that comes from fostering a relationship not with a doubtful teacher, but with the Muses themselves. All he had to do to prove this was to precisely mimic their competitive spirit through art. In the style of the Odyssey, Timon described his journey into the dark and misty underworld where he saw all the philosophers engaged in useless quarrel and disorganized arguing. Naming each one in turn with colorful insults and clever turns of phrase, Timon relentlessly exposed the lack of true authority at the head of every school of thought. When he arrives at Epicurus, who possibly wrote more books than anyone at the time, he calls him the last and most dog-like of the physicists, having come from Samos, son of a schoolteacher, yet the most uneducated of living things. His disparaging assessment of the best thinkers of his time echoes Heraclitus's remark that, "The learning of many things teacheth not understanding." A dancer with feet and with words, Timon freely employed the verses of both the old poets and the writings of other philosophers in order to drive home the point that no point of view is absolute, but rather, as he says, appearance is powerful in every way, everywhere. As a musician, he was aware that a sense of progress was only the result of juxtaposing events. He noted that nothing divisible into temporal parts can take place in a partless time. In other words, time is only perceptible through punctuated differences or rhythms, not through the continuity of events. He demonstrated this fact most clearly when he posed the older forms of poetry against the emerging scientific thought of his day, in a form which drew attention to their paradoxical conflict. Timon's poetry, then, shows that history, as it was coming to birth in Alexandria, was already a questionable notion. Timon's point of view can be summed up in the words of Bataille. "It is clear that the world is purely parodic, that each thing seen is the parody of another, or is the same thing in a deceptive form." The strongly abrasive and ironic personality of Timon gives us a nice contrast to the more serious and inquisitive students of the classical period. Wherever Timon cast his cyclopic gaze, he could not help but see a vast field of contradictions. It was clear from his unique perspective that no matter how large Ptolemy's library got, and no matter how much history was piled up in one place, it would not fulfill the need for a coherent, unified, and stable source of knowledge. In fact, it would lead to just the opposite. Timon knew that the reigning pedagogical models of his time were mere imitations, and just as a new king must imitate his father before him, so must it be through imitation that anyone can claim to know anything. Timon's perspective presents us with the troubling fact that nothing appears to us without a certain enigmatic power, which eludes all attempts to tie it to a final authority. By making it his goal to seek the limit of contradiction, by contradicting everyone, including himself, Timon incidentally revealed that contradiction has its own positive force, which simply announces a difference. And rather than locating some underlying unity beneath all claims to knowledge, contradiction ironically poses all knowledge against itself. Of all the figures of the past who could provide us insight into the way things used to be, Timon gives us a picture that only more strongly illuminates the great distance between the past and the present. In this respect, we might say that there was something characteristically modern about Timon. He was cynical, satirical, critical, and above all, nostalgic. There was only one thinker who Timon appeared not to contradict, simply because he appeared to have already done so himself. Whether due to a malicious attempt to erase his influence, or to the blindness of chance and necessity, we have perhaps fewer traces of his thoughts than we have of Timon's. This is one of them. In reality, we know nothing. Truth is in the depths. Democritus, the first rationalist, who sought to expose the unreason of human existence, was perhaps the only philosopher during Timon's life who he could have felt any true affinity with. In fact, out of all the fragments we have of Timon's writings, nowhere does he praise anyone, not even Pyrrho, as highly as he does the infamous atomist, whose name was never even once mentioned by Plato. When Timon ventured into the depths of Hades and looked upon the afterlife of philosophy, he came across their greatest champion and remarked, "Such was Democritus, the very wise shepherd of myths, and skilled disputant of both sides, among the best I ever read." In the end, Timon may have had a teacher after all, a teacher who knew how to speak in terms of contradictions and different meters. But the relationship between him and his forerunner was anything but conventional. It was indicative of an emerging technology of reading, which had only just begun to blossom in the age of Alexander. In this historical image we have constructed, where Timon and perhaps Democritus stand opposite the herd of scribes flocking to Alexandria, there is only one question which seems to hover before us like a ghost. What does this have to do with us? In the next video, we will return to Alexandria and elaborate on its connections with our own historical attitudes and ways of reading.